Thank you for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz. I've got David Horowitz coming up today, later today, hopefully, if everything is working okay and all the internet genies are out of the way. We'll see. I'm hoping. There's been a couple of issues today. But I want to talk a little bit in follow-up to my interview yesterday with Dr. E. Michael Jones, the author of The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit and Its Impact on World History. This 1,000-page book is very, very good in terms of looking at the history of revolution and revolutionaries and their negative impact on our politics, our culture, and our economy. And of course, Dr. Jones expands the definition of revolutionary to include any group or person who has opposed the Roman Catholic Church, which is a bit different than what I view as a revolutionary. But the real issue I have with the book, of course, is that somehow the revolution is inherently Jewish, and that it is the Jews who are the origins of every revolutionary movement from the time of Jesus right up till today. I reject that. I completely reject it. I think that he has some very painful chapters in there that are quite accurate about people who, or groups even, that have a Jewish background that have been very involved in revolutionary activity, specifically and particularly the Bolshevik Revolution, but also the Cultural Revolution, the Kulturkampf, if you will, that has permeated the United States right up till today. But I would argue, the fact that they have a Jewish background is not the relevant factor. The relevant factor is that they're revolutionaries. I could point to just as many Christian revolutionaries and Muslim revolutionaries, I suppose, and that whether they observe the Sabbath on a Saturday or a Sunday is not the salient question. The salient question is what the revolutionary mind is and why they're revolutionaries. And I think that I would argue that as Jews and as Christians who are believers in God, we ought to come together and oppose this revolutionary trend, which is corrupting our society and our nation. I also would suggest that Judaism, and I said this to Dr. Jones, is more vulnerable and has been historically more vulnerable to the blandishments of the revolutionary endeavor, the fire in the minds of men, as James Billington called it in his great book on that subject with that title. James Billington has been the Librarian of Congress. He's a very authoritative source, and he writes about the revolution from the time of the Illuminati and the French Revolution right up to the Russian Revolution. He's a Russian expert. He advised several presidents on relations with Russia, joined Reagan in his historic visits to Russia. So he's a guy who kind of knows what he's talking about. He's also an establishment figure, which, to my way of thinking, makes his revelations in this book even more relevant, because you can't say he's some kind of conspiracy person. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I'm just saying it's a legitimate and solid source. But Dr. Jones insists that this is a Jewish phenomena. The reason it's Jewish is because since the Jews of the time of Jesus did not recognize the ministry of Jesus, the messiahship of Jesus, and since they colluded with the Romans to execute Jesus, therefore they lost the Logos, and they no longer, they're contaminated, that we're sinful, that we're evil, that we're at war with nature and nature's God, if you will, and that we're subversive and we're revolutionary. And through this convenient theory, frankly, he's able to link Jews, or specifically, but more likely Jewish spirit, Jewish ideas, to every revolution that's ever happened, particularly those against the Catholic Church. Now, when I brought up to him the Albigensians, the Hussites, the Pelagians, these were all heresies against the Catholic Church, which he calls Judaized, even though there really were no Jews involved, as far as anyone can tell. And if they were side players. They were genuinely Christian revolutions against the Catholic Church. He says, well, they misinterpreted the Old Testament. Fine. Misinterpreted is the key word there. As I said, they did misinterpret it. They misinterpreted it to mean that when God commanded the children of Israel to defeat the Midianites and the Canaanites, somehow that applied to medieval Europe, and that they could defeat the Catholic Church. That is a misinterpretation of the Old Testament. But what I really want to talk about is the concept of Sicut Judaeis non. It was a concept that permeates Dr. Jones's book, and that he believes that the Jews need to get back to. This is an idea that was formulated by St. Augustine of Hippo in the early centuries of the Christian Church. And what it says basically is that the Christian is not to molest the Jew, not to attack the Jew, not to interfere with Jewish worship. But at the same time, the Jew is not to corrupt Christian society, which is to say that they're not to be involved in public life in a Christian nation, whether that be in the economy, the political system, or the culture, because their involvement would be a corruption of Christianity. And in the final chapter of his book, he quotes from an Irish priest, Dennis Fahey, who talks about Judaism as contaminating Christianity. So while we should leave the Jew alone and let him worship, we can't have too much contact with the Jew because they're evil, because they're fallen, because they're involved with a false religion. Now, in a practical sense, he wants to bring this back. What I would say to that is that if that were the case, and we had a system of Sicut Judaeis non, I would not be able to do this show. I would not be able to go online. I would only be allowed to talk to other Jews, because I might be corrupting the Christian culture. Jewish people in public life, in the culture, in the economy, they would not be allowed to function in a system of Sicut Judaeis non, because they would have to be segregated. I mean, this is why Europe eventually got involved in the ghetto, which is an Italian word. The first ghetto was in Venice. The Jew had to be separate. The Christian was obliged to leave the Jew alone and let them worship and not beat them up. But they could not engage in commercial life with the non-Jewish Christian world because of their corruption. That was the system of Sicut Judaeis non. The Jew is a second-class citizen. The equivalent in Islam is the dhimmi status, as I mentioned, where the Jew had no rights, and if the Jew kept his head low and minded his business, then he would be left alone. But if he got involved in public life in any form, then that's a violation of the dhimmi laws. And I would also say that it's comparable to Jim Crow in the United States before the Civil Rights Act, that black people de facto were not allowed to get involved in various aspects of American public life, except very select people. And that these laws were meant to separate blacks so they wouldn't have too much interaction with white people. This is a system of second-class citizenship. And so I oppose it for that reason. I more fundamentally oppose it because I would argue that the Jews did not lose our logos. We are not corrupted. We are internally corrupted for the same reason Christianity is corrupted. And that is because we have stopped believing in God. And because many of us are at war with God. But that's not because we're Jews. That's because we're rejecting Judaism in all but name. It's because we're rejecting the belief in the Lord our God, the King of the universe, the lawgiver. And we are resorting to the same heresy that Christians are resorting to. The Roman Catholic Church is more immune, as are Protestant churches, to this kind of heresy than Jews, because Catholics had armies, because Catholics had kings, they had empires, they had a pope, they had a Messiah that they could define. We didn't have any of those things. I mean, the reason the Roman Catholic Church is called Roman is because the Catholic Church, the early Christian church, was able to take over Rome. The Emperor Constantine became Christian. Thus, the Catholic Church became the state church of the Roman Empire. So yeah, they have secular power. So when you have a false Messiah emerge in the Catholic movement in medieval times, for example, like Jan Hus in Bohemia, the Catholic Church burns him at the stake, and 200 or 250 odd followers are all burned at the stake. Judaism couldn't do that to our false messiahs because we didn't have secular power, because we didn't have a king, and we didn't have a pope. So we were more vulnerable to these kinds of insidious influences, and that's what happened to Judaism in the 17th century when we had a false messiah by the name of Shabtai Zvi that took the entire Torah and Talmud and everything that we believed in, family values, faith in God, practicing, trying to be a holier people, and he turned it on its head. He introduced a satanic element, literally. And then that was followed by his main disciple in Europe in the 18th century. That was Jacob Frank. And these people corrupted Judaism in a way that is almost incalculable. It almost destroyed Judaism, and it continues to destroy Judaism from within, I would argue. My purpose here as a Jew speaking in public is to oppose this and to try to expose it and to say we got to get back to our raison d'etre, our covenant with God at Sinai, our Torah, and all of its moral and ethical precepts. We need to get back to belief in God, which most Jews no longer do. May I suggest as well that a lot of Christians no longer do either. It's not because of Jews. It's because they're inflicted by the same revolutionary faith, if you will. Now, I just want to finish up my thoughts on this segment by talking about the state of Israel, because I did ask Dr. Jones if he believes in Sicut Judaeis non, what about, which is to protect Jews and let them worship in peace, what about Israeli Jews? He didn't answer that question. He shifted the subject by saying, oh, well, this applies only to, this was developed, in early days before, when there was no Israel. All right, fine, but he's asking that it be brought back today. Israel exists today. So my question is, in a world of Sicut Judaeis non, how do you respond to the Jewish state of Israel? Now, the problem that someone like Dr. Jones and people who think in those terms have with the state of Israel is that it is Jewish. It is not a minority. Jews in Israel are not subject to Christian nations. It's a Jewish nation. It's majority Jewish. There's about 7 million Jews in Israel. There are about maybe 1 to 1.5 million non-Jews in Israel, most of whom are Muslims. But it is a Jewish state. And if you run by the premise that Judaism is somehow corrupted and evil and impure, then you view Israel as a corrupting influence on the world. I'm starting to really think about this and why they're so opposed to Zionism, why they view Zionism as revolutionary. It's because it empowers Judaism to have sovereignty like any other normal state in the world in the land that God gave the Jews and in the land that Jews historically were able to exercise sovereignty. And they do exercise sovereignty today after almost 2,000 years of exile from the time that Pompey, the Roman emperor, entered the temple, defiled the temple, and effectively ended Jewish sovereignty in Judea. Now, there were attempts after that to try to get back sovereignty, all of which failed. But the point is that in 1948, sovereignty was once again achieved. It's a miracle. It's a miracle that the Jews, after 2,000 years, survived and then were able to reestablish sovereignty in their homeland. It's a miracle that the Jewish aspect of that is intact and is relevant and is in fact quite dynamic, that the Hebrew language was revived and that is spoken there today, that they're in Jerusalem. These are incredible developments, and yet I think that Christians of the ilk of E. Michael Jones and others, who I'm not questioning their sincerity. I think they're well-meaning, but they view the very existence of the Jewish state as somehow a fly in the ointment of their theory that Jews have lost their logos. That they view it as a threat maybe to the Christian idea, which it's not. Judaism exists as its own organic idea. It's a covenant between God and the Jewish people through Moses at Sinai. It doesn't have anything to do with Jesus or Mohammed or anyone else. We exist on our own for our own reason. We have our own logos, and I think that the very existence of the state of Israel proves that we have logos, because Israel, as imperfect as it is, and it's not a utopia, is brimming with logos in every sense. It's spiritual. It's a merge between between reason and the order of the universe and a respect for genuine progress in society and reality and morality, with faith, with belief in God. That's what Israel is all about. That's why I would suggest that Christians should support Israel, frankly. And the charge against Israel brought by people like E. Michael Jones, which is completely hypocritical, is that they're engaging in acts of violence against non-Jews. And what I would suggest to that is that Israel is facing a genocidal enemy that wants to destroy it. And that inadvertently, perhaps, people like E. Michael Jones are giving aid and comfort to that enemy. I don't think he's consciously doing it, although he did go to Tehran and look at atrocity propaganda and talked about it on the show. Putting that aside, Israel's engaged in a war. And in a war, people get hurt. Houses get broken. We just saw a missile hit a house in central Israel last week. And then Israel retaliated by bombing houses in Gaza. It's a war. And in a war, people get killed. The question is how to stop the war, how to stop the missiles, how to stop the terror tunnels, how to stop the genocidal agenda of Israel's enemies. I pointed out that Israel does not have territorial designs on its neighbors, and Dr. Jones thought that was funny. He laughed and he said, well, what about the Golan? The Golan Heights are just that. They're heights, they're mountains. And that when Syria controlled the Golan Heights after 1948, and after, by the way, the British Mandate authorities lopped it off of Palestine and gave it to Syria, putting that aside, they used those mountains to fire artillery into Israel, which was in a valley, and to kill Jews. They were using those mountains to amass forces, to attack Israel and conquer and destroy Israel. Israel has a right, like any sane sovereign nation, to defend the lives and the property of its own people. And for that reason, in the Six-Day War, Israel took over those heights. So now Israel looks into Syria. It's a strategic issue. Now, in the long run, what I would suggest is that the Golan Heights could be negotiated if Syria wants to normalize relations with Israel. If Syria wants, that doesn't mean they have to even be friendly. It just means they have to normalize, like Egypt has normalized. When Egypt normalized relations with Israel, Israel withdrew from the Sinai, right? If Syria wants to do the same thing, Israel would, I would probably suggest, withdraw from at least part, if not all, of the Golan Heights in exchange for peace, in exchange for an exchange of ambassadors and some of the normal things that normal nations do, in exchange for a demilitarization of that area so that there's no threat to Israel's security. But that hasn't happened. A couple of years ago, I seem to recall that there was some talk about Syria negotiating with Israel, even though the Syrian negotiators wouldn't even be in the same room as the Israelis. God forbid they get, they might have contamination or something. Maybe they have their own version of Sicut Judaeis non, But of course with them, they don't have that because they want to destroy Israel. But putting that aside, what the Syrians suggested was that Israel had to completely withdraw from the Golan Heights first, before they would even agree to meet the Israelis to talk. And the point is, what's there to talk about then? Giving up the Galilee? I mean, the point is that it's at an impasse, is the point I'm trying to make here. And if the Syrians want to have peace with Israel, then anything is possible. Anything is negotiable. But that hasn't happened. So why the double standard? The double standard and the dislike of Israel is because it's Jewish and because it's capitalist. That threatens, these old oligarchies, these absolute dictatorships. Not because Israel's threatening them, but because Israel as an idea threatens them. Because the Israeli people and the Palestinian Arabs, by the way, and Israeli Arabs and other non-Jewish Israelis, they are freer, they're more prosperous, they're more spiritual, they're more advanced than other peoples in other nations in the Arab and Islamic world. And that threatens the Arab and Islamic order. It also threatens very religious Christians who think that this somehow refutes the divinity of Jesus as Christ, when it doesn't, because the Israelis are not concerned about Jesus as Christ. That's a Christian question. And I urge Christians to believe in Jesus. Jesus is the greatest man to ever live. He was able to, more than anyone else, transmit the Torah and all of its moral and ethical precepts to the Gentile world in a way that no Jew ever did. So for that reason, I personally believe in the dual covenant idea. I believe that there is a covenant between God and the Gentiles as represented by Jesus, the person of Jesus, who is messianic, certainly. Now, whether he's God and the Son of God, that's a Christian question. But I think that, again, the existence of Israel does not refute that. It has nothing to do with it. Israel is there because both the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims believe that by obtaining sovereignty in the Holy Land and by obtaining sovereignty in Jerusalem, the Jews will fulfill their mission, which is to create the stage for the coming of the Moshiach. Blessed be he, and may he come soon. Anyway, on that note, I want to thank you for watching, and have a great day.